Hi, I'm Rob Cosm. Welcome to my shop. I'm going to show you how to cut a mortise and tenon joint by hand. If you plan to build furniture that you intend to have last, you've got to learn this joint. And we're going to do it using a leg and an apron as if we were making a small table. Sit back and relax. I'm going to tell you everything I know. I'm Rob Cosman and welcome to my shop. We make it our job to help take your woodworking to the next level. If you're new to our channel, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell, which will alert you whenever we release a new video. Anytime we use a new tool or technique, we'll leave a description down below so that make it easier for you to find. All right, let's get back to work. There are lots of examples of mortise and tenon, and I find it interesting that very few people have ever seen it because rarely does it fail. What I'm talking about is commercial furniture that you buy. You've all seen what it looks like when a dowel comes apart. You've got a dowel on one end and you got a hole full of glue at the bottom on the other. Not a very good joint, but a well cut and fit mortise and tenon is going to last a long time. I'm going to show you some examples. First of all, what is it? Well, take a piece of wood and you reduce the end to be a little bit smaller, a little bit narrower than the original piece, and it fits into a corresponding rectangular shaped hole in the other piece. Now, let me show you some examples. First, I'll show you this one over here, since we're going to kind of duplicate this. It's a small table made entirely with hand tools several years ago. Now, what I did a little bit different here is instead of having one big long hole or mortise, I actually cut two mortises, which allowed you to keep this piece of wood in the middle to help strengthen that piece. If you had a big mortise here and another one over here, you don't have a lot left in that. I just found it would be very weak. So by doing it this way, you maintain some integrity of this piece. Very strong joint. The most stress placed on this chair is going to be right back here where this apron meets this leg. People rock back on their chair and you can imagine the amount of stress on that. Now, modern chairs typically are made with dowels and they almost always fail. This one was done a little bit differently. This is actually a prototype and it's been beating around the shop for well over almost 30 years and it's still together. It gets used for everything from standing on to piling stuff on. There's two tenons, just like you saw on that example. They come almost all the way through, but on this side I actually used two 1/2-inch dowels, and those dowels come all the way through that tenon into this cheek to lock that into place. Now, I just said dowels weren't very good. They're not, but this is a low stress joint. Rarely do you have people leaning over like that on their chair. But the way those two dowels lock this tenon, the wood will fail before that joint will fail. So, as I said, you've got to learn how to do it. Now, I'm going to introduce you to some traditional tools that were used to cut this joint entirely by hand. It is not difficult, but you have to pay attention. And the level of precision required, I think, exceeds that of a dovetail. We're going to use a large range of tools, but I'm going to highlight some unique ones that if you're not familiar with cutting mortise and tenons, then you may not have seen these before. I'll start over here. This is really the heart of the joint. It's called your mortise chisel. And just to contrast so that you see what I'm talking about, there's a typical beveled edge. It tends to be narrow this way. It has bevels on the side to allow you to get in, for instance, in cutting dovetails between the pins between the tails so that you don't bruise them. Whereas a mortise chisel has parallel sides. Lots of mass this way, not only because you're going to be really wailing on this thing, but those sides prevent or help prevent the chisel from twisting as you're chopping down into that hole. So I have 1/2-inch, 3/8, 5/16, quarter, and 3/16. Of course, you don't need them all, but if you're going to cut a mortise, you're going to use that to be the exact size of your joint. So a 1/4-inch mortise is going to be cut with a 1/4-inch mortise chisel, and we're going to use a gauge in order to lay out the tenon as well. So what we would do, and there's numerous gauges on the market, this is the one that we made. It's got two cutters, and you loosen this brass locking knob. You squeeze that 1/4-inch chisel between those two cutters, tighten it up, and now when you remove it and go lay out your tenon, it's going to be the exact width of that chisel, and that's exactly what you're looking for. So you have a mortise gauge, and you'll use a marking gauge as well, but that's fairly common. This is my small router plane, and you'll find that this comes very handy for getting the face of the tenon to be absolutely parallel to the face of the board. And if you have to go in and fix the shoulder. And the interesting thing about a mortise and tenon joint is you never see it. Once it's put together, it's hidden for life. However, the part that you do see is where the sides, or the shoulders that go around the tenon, come up against that face where the mortise is. And that's got to be precise. You don't want any gaps there. If you can't get it perfect from the saw, then you use a tool called a shoulder plane. And what's unique about the shoulder plane, I'll contrast it to something like a block plane. Block planes, bench planes, the blade does not go all the way to both sides. So you could not get up against a vertical surface. Imagine trying to plane this right in that corner, you can't do it. But with a shoulder plane and your blade runs all the way, that allows you to go right into that vertical wall. And by the way, the blade is always a little bit wider than the plane body, so that if you're going to work one side or the other, you can come in, push it down, and that'll bring the blade flush with the edge of the plane so that it doesn't step on you. And what I mean by that is if the blade were in, each pass would leave a little bit of material in the corner, and the next pass it would kick it out, kick it out, kick it out. You want that to be cutting so that it's right in line with the side of the plane. That is called a shoulder plane. Two more tools, and you can get by with one, but I like to have the option. Crosscut, small crosscut. So I actually call this a joinery crosscut. So the cutting teeth are very close to the heavy brass back, which provides a lot of stability this way. And the idea is to get good enough that you can go in there and literally join right from your saw, so that you don't have to come in and fix that shoulder with a chisel or a shoulder plane after the fact. However, you always have to allow for that possible error. And then you have something called a tenon saw. What a tenon saw is, has rip teeth. It's got a little more of a stout blade, because typically you're going to be making a deeper cut. And we are going to mimic this joint, so we're going to cut. I'm not going to do two just for the sake of the time, because it's essentially the same technique. I'm going to cut a mortise or a square hole in this leg, and then we are going to cut a tenon on the end of this apron, and we're going to fit it to it. In future videos, we're going to go in and actually taper that leg and take you all the way through the process of doing that part of a piece of furniture. Okay, let's lay this out. First thing we have to determine is what size chisel we're going to use, in other words, what size mortise. And as you know, or you may not know, when you talk about a mortise and tenon joint, typically in cutting the tenon, you go third, third, and a third. Here's what I mean. If I were joining two pieces of 3/4 inch material together, if I made that tenon a 1/2 inch wide, and I only had an 1/8 of an inch left for shoulders, worse than that, when it came to cutting my mortise over here, and I had just 1/8 inch walls to house this big 1/2 inch mortise, makes for a very weak joint because of these narrow or very thin outside walls. So typically what you would do is cut that down so that you had 1/3 of the thickness in the shoulder, 1/3 the thickness in the tenon, and 1/3 thickness in the shoulder over here, which corresponded with a mortise that was 1/4 of an inch or 1/3 of the thickness, and you had 1/4 inch on either outside edge. Because this board with the tenon in it has been reduced in strength to whatever this thickness is. So you don't want it too small, because that really weakens it. No matter how big this apron is, you've got this little tiny tenon, and that becomes your weak link. So you always want to try to keep as much material as possible, but you can't sacrifice it over here either. Well, in this case, we are going to add this apron into this leg. So this thin piece is going to be cut and joined into this thicker piece. That means that we can keep a little more material over here, because we have the extra material over here. Now, I'm not going to do a double, I'm going to do a single just for the sake of getting through this. But we have the option of a 1/2 inch, or we could go down to 1/4 of an inch. And as I said, I think 1/4 inch is too small, you're sacrificing too much. I actually think the 1/2 inch is going to be too big, not because of the tenon, but because of the mortise over here. And you have to take into account that we're cutting this in pine. It's not really strong, so we have to keep a fair bit of material here to maintain the integrity of the strength of this leg. Think about it. You build a hall table, and you've got that attached like that. That's the only contact between the leg and the rest of the piece of furniture, and somebody bumps that with a vacuum, and there's a lot of torque being applied way down here, a lot of leverage on that joint. So you got to keep that in mind. What I'm going to suggest on this piece is that we keep our tenons and our mortises out toward the outside surface. So instead of having them in the middle, we're going to move it out here. Maybe we'll keep an 1/8 of an inch gap or 1/8 of an inch reveal right here and an 1/8 of an inch over here. And the reason why, I'm going to show you. We're going to lay it out on the end of this. I have a small rule. Now what I'm going to suggest, and we'll just draw it out and see how it looks, if we were to keep a 1/4 of an inch out here, go with a 3/8 mortise. Now I'm just going to draw that all the way across because we need to know what we're removing for material. And you got to remember we're going to have an apron over here as well, so let's lay this one out. Keep a 1/4 of an inch here. There's our mortise. Now, this I think applies to softer, weaker woods in particular. I don't want to chop this mortise all the way to here and have this mortise meet it all the way to here, because then you end up with this chunk of material and nothing connecting it from the rest of the leg. So I'm going to prefer to stop this back here somewhere. Let's measure it and see, because we do need some depth, because our only strength is going to come from where the cheek, the long grain cheek of the tenon, makes contact with the long grain inside face of both sides of the mortise. This is end grain, so it doesn't matter if it touches the bottom, there's no glue strength gained there. That is end grain, that is end grain. So even though this is long grain and this is long grain, there's no real advantage to it touching. There's no significant glue strength. So the main strength is going to come from this surface and that surface touching the two inside faces of that mortise, which, by the way, is also the reason why this needs to be so precise. If it's loose and you put more extra glue in there, traditional wood glue does not have gap filling capabilities, and that joint is going to fail. If it's too tight and you have to really pound it in there, most of your glue is going to get pushed to the bottom of the mortise. Now you're relying primarily on a mechanical fit, and if you think about the stress on that joint we talked about on a chair leg, that's eventually going to wiggle loose and your joint's going to fail. So this is a very precise joint. You want that surface and that surface to literally touch that surface and that surface so that the glue can do its job. So with that in mind, we want this to be as deep as possible, yet we still want to maintain some integrity here. So we have 7/8 of an inch. I'm going to suggest that we go 3/4. So if we go 3/4 of an inch deep, and the same thing over on this one, now that's not going to give us a lot, but it is going to maintain, or it's going to keep this piece, make it a little more solid. We've got 3/4 and 3/4. We've got enough surface there that I'm comfortable with that being adequate. If we needed to, we could even come in from the inside and pin those, but we'll save that for another video. So I think we can go with that. So I prefer to actually lay out the mortise with a marking gauge, but I'm going to give you an option. I'm going to take the mortise gauge, we loosen it up, unscrew this cutter, set the 3/8 mortise chisel in there, and tighten that up, and then come in here with this threaded piece of brass and tighten that up so that it stays put. Now, I'm going to use this primarily for laying out the tenon, but you could use it for the mortise as well. In other words, what you would do is simply set that where you want it, lock it down. Actually, I would prefer to do it on the close side, then your cutters aren't quite so far away from the head of the tool. And you could go in and lay that out. Actually, before we do that, we have to determine where we're going to put this. So let's just lay this out first. That's just a rough. Okay, so there's our overall length. Now, we can't come too close to this end, particularly on softwood like pine. We've got to leave enough material here that'll hold that together. I'm going to suggest on this one, we probably, I think we can get away with 5/8 of an inch. So this will be one end of the mortise. Now down here, we can get as much material as we want. All we need down here is just enough to give us a neat little shoulder so that when we come in, we can make sure that that makes nice contact and shows a nice tight joint. So on this end, I'm going to suggest we can get away with just 1/8 of an inch. So we'll put a line here representing the opposite end of the tenon. Now, as I said, you can come in here and you can lay it out with a mortise gauge. The problem with this gauge is that puts your bevels on the outside. Not quite an issue on here because it's going to be concealed, but I prefer to actually use just a marking gauge and work to one line, and I'll show you how I do it, but just bear in mind that you can use that. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to set the gauge for that outside edge, and I'm going to scribe a line between those marks. Nice thing about a wheel style gauge is as you need to get close, you can just roll it, and that prevents you from going too far. Now, to make this a little easier, I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to draw some perpendicular lines, perpendicular to that gauge mark I just made. Don't really need to worry about a parallel mark out here because of the way the mortise chisel works. These are going to help me set my chisel down and keep it perpendicular to that line. Okay, now I'm going to use my 3/8, and you want that to be sharp enough that it'll cut. You don't want it to be too acute. You're really wailing on this thing, so you need to have that fairly stout. But since you're actually going to be going down there and literally slicing across the end grain, you want to bite in. Now, one last thing we need to do, and that is we need to take into account how deep we're going to chop. We've already determined that, but we need to lay it out on the chisel. I find the easiest way to do it is to simply come in like this, lay it there, and put a mark with a Sharpie, which is easy enough to come off on that stone. Easy to see. Doesn't wear off too easy. I'm just going to check it to make sure, and that's going to allow me to get right to that line. Now, when we set out for this, we want to be able to see plumb. I got to clear my bench off, but we want to set this in a position where we're able to see plumb so that we keep those sides of that mortise perfectly square to this face. If we don't, we put it together and our apron's going to be off to one side or the other. All right, so I've got this trapped so that I can see plumb. I've got it over top of the bench, not over the dog hole, or not over the gap where the vise is. I'll hold that in place. Now, I drew lines on here, and I want to explain to you what they're for. When I set the chisel down, instead of trying to get this side of the chisel parallel to that line, as long as the tip of the chisel is parallel to those lines, then it's going to be square in reference to that gauge line. Now, I also want to highlight something else. I'm going to do it with pen at the risk of not being able to get it off. So this is the edge. Come on, pen. That's the edge of the mortise, and this is the edge of the mortise. The last thing I'm going to do is finish there. So I'll start probably on this one, and I'll start on this one in this direction. And I'll save that last little bit, and you'll see why. So I know how deep to go. And the way this works, it's really interesting. It'll just keep pushing the shavings forward, the chunks. It's easy to separate them on the side. You always chop your mortise parallel to the parallel to the way the grain runs, never across this way. Now, the sooner we can get to full depth, the better. So I'm going to start right on this one, and I'm lining it up. And by the way, I'll tell you now, The reason why I only work to one line, I find it drives me crazy if I'm trying to keep that chisel between two lines. It almost always makes me think I'm sitting on top of one or the other. So by having one line, I only have to worry about that side being over here far enough. And I will also say you could go in there with a block of wood and clamp that right on the line and use that as a gauge to help hold that plumb. I'm going to do this without, but that is a way of ensuring that your hole or your mortise the walls stay perpendicular to the face of the piece. I've got a square here too that we'll use to check occasionally. So we're going to get right on there. I'm up against, or I'm right against that gauge line. My chisel, I've set it down right on that perpendicular line, the pencil mark I made. Now, and I'm eyeballing this to keep it plumb. It's pine, so it doesn't take much to drive that down. I'm going to step back here probably 1/4 of an inch. Hardwood, you probably can't take as much. Softwood, quite easy. I'm going to step back at this one about 1/8. I'm not going to do anything to remove that waste material just yet. Again, I'm using those pencil lines to keep this chisel so that the sides are parallel to that line. Now at this point, I'm going to, no, it's not deep enough yet. Try it again. Again, using that pencil line. And I want to get down full depth as quick as possible. Now, I don't know if you're noticing, but I've got to do a little bit of steering as I'm chopping that to keep it from twisting in the hole. Now, I didn't tighten that up enough. These pieces come out quite easily. Okay, I can see my mark is right on, or my Sharpie mark is right at the surface. Now I'll push that down. It's almost not sticky enough. Okay, so those chunks come out quite easily. I prefer to operate it like you would operate the bolt on a rifle, meaning instead of holding it like this and pushing it, which might allow it to go one side or the other, keep it just in the center of your palm, and hopefully the sides of the chisel will reference off the sides of the mortise and allow that to go in the direction you want as opposed to veering left or right. Now, I'm down to depth, and it's really interesting how this works because I can make the next chop go right to depth. There's lots of room for the debris. That's what happens is when you first start, in order for this material to move back, it's got to have an opening. So as you make each successive chop a little deeper, there's lots of room for that debris to go. And now I can go right to the bottom. So I'm going to come in here, which means I'm going to be a full 1/8 of an inch, set my chisel right on that line. A little bit of steering. And I'm watching to make sure. Let's just check and see. That's not bad. I'm off maybe, it would be less than 1 degree. Push that out. And you see how these pieces come out? It's really quite amazing. Now, at this stage, I'm going to grab my 1/4 inch chisel. And the reason I'm doing that, if I use this to try to get out that debris, I risk wrecking those walls. All I want to do is just get some of this material that has been cut free, but is jammed in there. If you use not so much with softwood, but if you're doing this in hardwood, and you try to go in there and pry that out with a regular bevel edge chisel, it just flexes it too much. So by using a mortise chisel, which is far more stout, I can get in there and just get rid of some of that material that has been severed, but just got jammed in the hole. Now you'll notice that I'm prying against this surface. That's the reason why I don't start right here. This is going to allow me to go in and do a little bit of prying without fear of wrecking the perimeter of that mortise. I just cut myself. I accidentally touched the end of that chisel. Okay. Now we got to come back here. We're at the depth. We're at depth from about here over, but we've got to come in here. Oh, I got to go get a Band-Aid. That was more to keep the blood off the wood than anything else. Now what I'm doing is just coming back, working my way backwards, and the shape of the chisel will push that debris. It allows me to go full depth. Now as I get closer to the line, I can still pry a little bit before I come in here. So I'll get down there, and what I want to do is I want to get this crest, which is going to become my leverage point, or my pivot point, and get in there, and I can break that stuff free. Still allows me to, I can leverage against this without fear of damaging anything. But now that I've got most of that material out, now I'll come in and I'll work right to the line. Now on this one, I'll get it started. Just a little pull to free it up. I'm going to do this in 3 steps. Okay, now on this one, after I get it started, I'm just going to have a look this way to make sure that I'm going plumb in that direction. Just a little wiggle, just enough to free it. Now, as long as I can get that pivot point down below the surface, I can still go in there and do a little bit of leveraging. I don't want to touch this top edge, but I can scrape that bottom edge, the bottom surface of that mortise to this point, and that'll make it so I can easily get rid of that stuff. Now we'll go the other way. And this is where you want your chisel to be sharp, because you're coming down on an end grain wall and you need it to bite. You don't want it to slip. We'll put that right on the gauge line. Have a quick look to make sure that we're plumb in that direction. And do the same thing with this 1/4 inch. Get down there, just a little wiggle. Now pine, you can almost pry or free up those fibers just by leveraging against your fingers. It's soft enough. Now I'm going to replace my marking gauge cutter with a narrower diameter one. This is 3/8 and it's quite stout, so it's not susceptible to being broken. And I'm going to set it for the depth that I want. Again, I'm taking it right off of the chisel, and I can put that down in there, and I can run that back and forth. And if I can't, then I know I don't have the depth I need. And I suspect, well, try to do that with a normal cutter and there's a good chance that it's going to break. Now that shifted on me, so let me go back and do that again. I need to tighten it up a little bit more. I think I'm still a little bit shallow. Yeah, I'm sitting on the bottom, so I got to go in here. So what do I do to go in and make this a little bit deeper? Well, I'm not going to do it this way. I'm just going to use this to get rid of the loose debris. So we got a bunch of bumps in there. The easiest way to get rid of them is to take your chisel and just make a bunch of small, we'll call them incisions, small chops. And what it does is it breaks up those fibers and makes it really easy to remove them. Try to keep that chisel from twisting. Now, see what we can get out. Again, the narrower mortise chisel just keeps it from getting jammed. Now we'll go ahead and see if we're down to depth. Check this before I do it. Well, I'll keep that laying flat so that it doesn't dent the surface. I may be prying on this too much. Okay. Now I'll get a beveled edge chisel and just go down there and get rid of anything that's stuck on the side. I don't want to change the fact that these two sidewalls are parallel to each other. So I'm just going to carefully go in there and just get rid of any of the little stringy stuff that might be hanging on. Okay, so that is done. Now I'm going to just check this back wall to make sure that it looks like it might be sloped a little bit. Yeah, it is. So I've got to go in here and just pare down that back wall a little bit. I think that one's okay. Okay, so that mortise is done, and now we'll cut the tenon to fit that, and before we assemble it, we'll take the final cleanup pass, get rid of any of these marks. The brass sometimes leaves those black marks on there, and we also want to get rid of our pen and pencil marks. I want to clean that off right now because I hate looking at it. All right, that's better. It is. So this is the end we're going to cut. I want a nice deep marking gauge line all the way around. You do that edge. Sometimes it's easier to roll it. That edge will help you when it comes time to dressing those shoulders. I'll put it in the vise. Now get our mortise gauge. And we're going to have about 1/8 of an inch reveal out there, so we're going to center this in the apron. I think we already did this, but I'm going to check it. So I'll just push it down there like that and leave a couple of marks, and then do that, and it's not centered, so we got to come to my right. I usually just do this by guessing it, and then by pushing it in like that, leaving a mark, and then doing it like this, you can tell whether or not you're right on. That looks good. Okay, with that locked, holding firmly on this side, and I find it easier if you take multiple light passes and then just gradually go deeper, and that helps prevent the grain from wanting to make those cutters wander. And I want a nice deep gauge line. Again, it makes it easier when it comes time to perfect those cheeks. And then we'll go down the face. Okay, now I'll just identify the waist. Not that we're going to cut the wrong side, but this will hopefully ensure it. Okay, this is where we want to try to get the sawing part right the first time. So I'm going to go in. I've got to make a cut all along there, which is fairly long, and down the face. I prefer to do these ones first, then we'll cut these ones back. So my saw has these little starter teeth in the front, which makes it a little bit easier. So I'm going to come in here. Actually, let me show you another little tip if you want to do this. It takes a bit of time, but sometimes it's worth it. You can get yourself a little, what they call a knife wall, by taking a chisel. Actually, I'm going to use my 17 degree. It'll slice through that stuff a little easier. Starting in the waist, coming up against that gauge line that I told you to make nice and deep. If you start back here and on a somewhat shallow bevel, go in until you hit that wall. And what it's going to do is going to give you a really easy place to start your cut. Now we can go in, set the teeth of the saw right up against it. I'm going to start on the back side. And what I'm attempting to do is to get this part of the curve started first. Then once that's started, it'll keep itself in line. I can follow the plumb cut so that I keep that one in line. Now I'm going to lean back here, and I'm watching my saw as it follows the gauge line down this face. And hopefully that curve I started along here is going to keep the saw in line in that direction. Now I don't want to go any lower than the gauge line, so be careful as you get close. If you have enough, or if the set on your saw is narrow enough, that'll help in making a nice straight cut. Remember, straight simply means shortest distance between 2 points, so you've got to aim it but then from that point it should carry on. Now if your cheek over here is somewhat narrow, or thin, I actually push against it to help keep that kerf guiding the saw cut. If this is a narrow piece, any pressure laterally from the saw will cause that to bend out, and that allows the saw to wander. But if you put a little bit of pressure here, that's keeping pressure on both sides of the saw blade, helping it to track properly. Okay, now on this one we can do the same thing, but I'm going to go in and I'm going to attempt to do it without that tip. So what I'm going to do is start back here first with my bungled thumb, press laterally against it to help get it started. And by starting on an angle like this, I only have to focus on one spot. If you set your saw down like this and try cutting, you're having to focus along the entire long 3-inch long line. But this way, on an angle, I can continue to cut, and as I cut and I move along that gauge line, I can make any adjustments side to side. So at that point, I've got my kerf started here. Now I'll do the same thing, which is stop focusing on this, focus over here until my cut is right at that gauge line, and then I can slowly bring my saw back up this way. Again, I'm using the kerf that's been cut to help guide the saw so that it continues on the path I want, which is nice and straight. Now if I needed to, I could turn this around so I could push against that piece, but that waist is actually pretty stiff. Watch your gauge line. Okay, that's close enough. Now I'm going to remove that waist next, and to do that I'm going to use my bench hook. And this is just a device that helps me support the piece while it's being sawn, and it also protects my bench top. I'm going to use a crosscut saw for this. This is another situation where if you want, you can go in and you can create that little knife wall. Working in the waist, just carefully. You want to be on enough of an angle so that you're not going to skip by that gauge mark and end up making a mess on the face of your board. This one needs to be just a little deeper. Now this is a very shallow cut. I'm going to bring it right out here. Again, as I mentioned, the purpose of this is so that when I saw through this piece, if I was going to, I'd be sawing into my sacrificial bench hook instead of my bench. So it's a fairly wide cut. I'm going to squeeze the workpiece to the fence to hold it in place. That frees up my index finger to act as a pointer to help that saw get started exactly where I want. I do it on an angle for the same reason, so that I can focus on where the blade is making contact with the wood. Now, I think I've already left a little too much material on here. That's all right, we can fix it. I don't want to go into that tenon at all because it's already relatively small in comparison to this piece. Now we'll do this one, we'll do it without the knife wall. Index finger. Get it started. So at that point, if it's in the right spot, you can make little adjustments side to side so that you follow on the waist side of that gauge mark. Now what this does require is you need to develop a sense of where plumb is. And I'll say this, a pistol grip saw will help you do that. If you're using a round handled saw, it doesn't register in your hand. This does. And after a fair bit of this, and it doesn't take forever, plumb will be right. You'll just know this is plumb. This is 10 degrees, that's 10 degrees if you're cutting dovetails, but this becomes extremely advantageous when you're doing something like this, because instead of having to focus on, am I making a plumb cut, all of my concentration can be in following that gauge line across the face of the board. And that's what's going to be seen. I'm just checking that to make sure that I don't cut into that tenon any more than I have to. Okay, now we'll put this in the vise. I'm going to use a larger or a wider chisel just so I can get a little more of this done. And I'm just going to reference against the cheek and just finish that little bit. Turn around, do the other side. There's just that little bit of debris in the corner. Okay, now we need to lay out the ends. So we'll put this in place. This is going to be flush on the top. Now this is where I'm going to use my little combination square, and I'll show you why. First thing I need to do is come square across the end. Now I want a plumb line to follow. And you obviously can't do that with a square, but you can do it with a combination square by just pulling that rule up until you clear the bottom, and then drop your plumb line. Now I want this standing plumb, so I'll just check it with my square. I advocate that anytime you're cutting something in your vise, take a second to make sure it's standing plumb, and that'll reinforce your ability to make a plumb cut by feel. Now you notice I reached for my dovetail saw. Why? Well, this is a small cut. I have more control with this than I do with the larger tenon saw, and this is the one I prefer to use. So I'm going to get right up against the line. I want to be careful, don't want to cut out here, you'll notice it. Now we can lay this one on its side. I want that to be level, so I'm just eyeballing the top edge with that strip on my bench. I'm going to use my crosscut saw. Another place where you can come in, create that little wall. Allows me to set right against it. You want to be careful on this one. Again, you don't want to, any scoring that occurs out here is going to show in your finished joint, so you've got to be careful on that. At the same time, I try not to be overly careful, which means don't purposely saw in this direction just because you're afraid of cutting into that shoulder. It's best to just do a little bit of practice till you eventually get to the point where you can take this right from the saw. Okay, now I'm going to come in and I'm just going to clean up anything I see wrong. Now I'm going to grab my magnifiers, and what I'm looking for is that gauge line that I made. If you remember, I told you to make it nice and deep because this is where it helps. So I'm going to set my chisel right on it. If you look real closely, I don't know if the camera can pick it up or not, but down here I don't have anything. The cut I made is perfectly parallel to the gauge line, but over here I can set my chisel on the gauge line and I have debris above it. Well, that means the joint's not going to close properly. So I'm going to set my chisel right on that little gauge line and then push it maybe slightly undercut, but not much. And the 17-degree chisel, taking a fairly narrow cut, it's only 1/2 inch wide, allows me to push through that material with very little effort, affording me lots of control. Flip this over and do the other side because it's easier to work on this side. Now, I didn't do a very good job on this one either because I can see material above the gauge line all the way across. If I tried to put that joint together, this wouldn't be tight, the part we see. So that's why you've got to come in and remove that. Now out here, I'll just go part way. And then I'm going to do the same thing here, and then I'm going to go straight in. Now I undercut a little bit there, but fortunately that's going to be up at the top, and you're not going to see that because the tabletop will be sitting on there. Okay. Now I'm going to take a quick look and see if I can still see my gauge line from the mortise gauge. And if I see my gauge line and material up beyond it, then I know this is going to be a little bit too wide. Small shoulders on the bottom. Okay. I think I might be a little bit too long. I am. So I've got to take off a bit of material on the overall length of the tenon. So I'll come in here, set my chisel just a little bit inside of that pen mark, and just pare down. Probably need to do both. Let's try that again. The fewer times I have to fit this, the better. It just prevents things from getting beat up now. Just looking down in there and I see some debris in the bottom. Want this to be snug, but not so tight that I have to pound it together. And it definitely cannot be loose. So if it moves back and forth, I've got to fix it. So we'll come out here first and just kind of try it. That's not bad. Might need a little adjustment. That's a little bit too snug. I could easily pound it together, but I'm gonna improve it. I'll show you how. Give me a second. I'm just going to clear the bench off. Okay. Now, when I inspect that by eyeballing it, those sides look pretty close to being parallel to these sides. This one, however, looks like it might slope out just a little bit, so I'm going to try that one first. I'll put it in the vise, and I'm going to use my small router plane, so I've got to keep that bench dog down lower than the surface. This is one of my favorite tools for when it comes to sneaking up on something and getting it precise. I'm going to drop that down. This is also where you could go in and reference that cutter right on that marking gauge line that was left. Now, when you push this across, the shape of the cutter is going to pull the tool down like that. So I've got to put a lot of weight on my left side to keep that so that this ends up parallel to this. So I'm going to go out here. Sometimes I find it easier if you just kind of angle it a little bit, more of a shearing cut. Now, as I guessed, I was off a little bit. That's why I'm taking more material off on the inside than I did out here. They also make a large shoulder plane, but I like this one because the cutter is really close to the support of this flat part, so you can get quite precise with it. Now, before I go any further, I'm going to try this and see if that wasn't what was needed. Maybe just a little bit snug, and I'm being fussy. So now I flipped it around. I'm not going to do any more work on that because I know that one is exactly where it needs to be. I'm going to try the opposite side, see if I can find any remnant of the original gauge line. Is that the side I just did? It is. Okay, so I can see the original gauge line right here. I'll go in and drop that cutter down. Northern white pine is such a easy wood to cut. It's fantastic for learning these techniques. Let's try that. Okay, that felt good. That means that it's making contact on both sides, not excessively tight to where it's going to push that cheek out. And yet I'll be able to get a little bit of glue in there. So let's just make sure. So when we inspect this, that shoulder's nice and tight. Now, before I assemble that, something else I will do is I'm going to take my, just because it's convenient, my little squirrel tail, and I'm going to go in there and I'm just going to cut. That needs to be sharpened. I'll try my block plane. I'm going to cut a little chamfer on the leading edge of that tenon. Now what that will do is when I go in and I only glue the inside here, any glue you put on the face of the tenon is going to get squeezed off and it's going to end up out here, and now you got to go in and try to clean that off. Put all of your glue on the inside of your mortise, and I would coat this side and that side. And what those little chamfers will do will allow some of that glue to actually slide up the side so that you get good coverage. But I don't want to put this together now because in a future video we're going to go in and we're going to show you how to taper that so you get a nice looking furniture leg. We'll also, at this point, we would go in and finish playing that too. Obviously that has to be done before you can assemble. I wish there was some way of telling you how tight that is, but if you can just, didn't take a whole lot of work to put that down and to get that in place. So there you go. If you like my work, if you like my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos to help take your woodworking to the next level. And I've always said better tools make it a whole lot easier. If you click on the icon with the plane and the chisel, it'll take you to our website, introduce you to all of our tools, and also talk to you about our online and in-person workshops. Good luck in your woodwork.